My name's Laura McDonald. Welcome. Please, please ensure that every mobile phone is either off or on silent. If you do desperately need to have a conversation, please take it outside out of respect to our authors and our panel. Without further ado, I would love to invite our esteemed panel to the stage. We have 7 people joining us. We have one very kind translator. So if I could, without further ado, please invite our moderator, Jonathan Chenin, and then we have Mr. Taha Beljanun, who will be translated by Anne Solange. We have Aslan Dabbagh. Joining us, we have Reza Aslan and Adaf Soueif. Yes, and William Dalrymple will be introducing. And just so that you know, both Reza and Adaf have another panel directly after this, but they will be able to do just a few minutes of book signing. So we're going to get our whole panel over to the author's book signing desk afterwards. Please don't come to the stage, go straight over there, and we'll usher them straight over so you get a chance to talk to them. So I'd now like to introduce, because this event is actually sponsored by the Edinburgh International Book Festival and the British Council, I would like to ask Charlie Walker to introduce the panel.
Thanks very much. I'm not going to introduce the panel. That's my friend William will do that. But I did want to just say good morning and welcome and something about the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference. Half a century ago, Edinburgh hosted the first World Writers' Conference, and it was an incredibly influential event. It was attended by Norman Mailer, Rosamund Lehman, William Burroughs, among others, and India was represented by Khushwant Singh. 50 years later, in August 2012, the British Council and the Edinburgh International Book Festival convened another Edinburgh World Writers' Conference. And Adaf Soueif was the presenter of the keynote address there, Should Literature Be Political? A number of themes have been drawn from this conference that will now travel around the world. 2 themes have been taken up here in Jaipur, and those are today's theme, a national literature, and censorship today, which was taken up, I think, in the session on Saturday. Apart from Jaipur, the themes of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference will travel to Cape Town, Berlin, Cairo, Toronto, Istanbul, Krasnoyarsk, Kuala Lumpur, Beijing, Port of Spain, New York, St. Malo, and Melbourne. And in 2013, there'll be another Edinburgh Writers' Conference in August in Edinburgh to bring together the learning from these events, and that will be followed by a publication. So the British Council is delighted to work with the Jaipur Literature Festival and the Edinburgh International Book Festival to bring these events to Jaipur. And without further ado, then, I'll hand over to William Dalrymple to introduce the panel. Thank you.
You're getting 2 introductions today and 7 panelists. You're getting your money's worth. At Jaipur, we've always made a great point of trying to concentrate on regions outside the Anglophone world. My colleague Namita, as you know, is passionate about the non-English literature of this country. But I think this is the first time we've really managed to gather a single panel with such distinguished writers in Arabic. We've had Adaf before, but we're extremely proud to bring Taha Beljanun. I think one of the things that we have also failed in over the years is having enough Francophone literature. So Taha ticks 2 important boxes for us. Taha Beljanun is one of France's most celebrated writers. His first novel, Haruda, was published in 1973. Since then, he's written numerous novels, short stories, poetry, and essays. He's best known for his trilogy, The Sand Child, The Sacred Night, and The Wrong Night. Adaf Soueif, who runs one of the world's most brave and wonderful literature festivals, the Palestine Lit Fest, that takes writers into Gaza and across the West Bank and does amazing work in Ramallah with the university and has had its events broken up by Israelis year after year and still carries on. As well as doing that, she's also the Booker shortlisted author of The Map of Love, which has been translated into 30 languages. And her most recent books are Cairo, My City, Our Revolution, and Reflections on Islamic Art, in which we had a nice jaunt to that lovely museum in Qatar together. Aslan Dabbagh, British-Palestinian writer based in London. First novel out of it, been listed for the Guardian Book of the Year in 2011 and 12. Her short stories have appeared in anthologies published in Granta, International Pen, and the British Council. She was the 2005 English Pen nominee for David T.K. Wong Short Story Award. She's currently working on her 2nd novel about expatriate living. Reza, who doesn't seem to be on this list, but I have to... Reza Aslan is a general hero, and anyone that went to his last session in the Baitak will know what a treat you're all in for. We last came across each other when he gave us an astonishing keynote session in Sydney Opera House at the last Sydney Writers' Festival and got one of the great sort of standing ovations of literary history. So you're in for a treat with him. Jonathan Shainin, you all know, is the esteemed editor of Caravan magazine and the man that has been a kind of shot in the arm for literary long-form journalism in this country. And Anne, my thing open. Anne Solange-Nobel is joining us from Gallimard and is going to do wonderful translation for Tahar. I don't think Tahar really needs it, judging by the wonderful English she's been speaking so far. Anyway, welcome them all, please. Maps of Love and Hate, Nationalism and Arab Literature.
Hello, everyone. Am I on here? Are you sure? Yes, there we are. All right. It's quite an honor to be here with this stage full of luminaries. And I thought the best thing to do might be to start in a very broad place and to play a bit with the geographical categorization that has been assigned to our panel, and to just ask a very broad question about is it reasonable to speak of a single Arab literature or to speak of an Arab literature in English in the way that, for example, we speak of Indian writing in English here, and maybe to add to that question, to what extent is this notion of an Arab literature perhaps a category imposed from the outside in a way where, you know, among Western publishers, one might see a kind of Arab literature as a kind of category in a bookshelf, in a store, I mean. So Adaf, let me start with you. We talked about this a little bit before. What do you think of when you think of an Arab literature or of multiple Arab literatures?
Yeah, I think of Arab literature, as in... actually, I should first start by thanking the British Council, because...
I should have done the same.
Yeah, because it's under their auspices that I'm here. I was actually told that when I came here this year, all I would have to do is re-speak the talk I gave in Edinburgh about should literature be political. And of course, now that I'm here, it's all completely different. But that's fine. We'll deal with that. No, it's wonderful to be here. It's amazing to be back in Jaipur. I think it's the best, the nicest literary festival there is. It's terrific, really. So thank you, Jaipur. I think, no, it's not at all a notion inflicted from outside. There is an Arab literature. There is a literature that has been written in Arabic from pre-Islamic times. It was poetry then, of course, and now it's everything: poetry, fiction, essay, and I think that the key thing that makes it possible to speak of an Arab literature is that it's a literature that is aware of itself as an Arab literature. In other words, a poet working in Arabic today in Egypt is aware of the poetry that is being and has been written in Iraq, in Palestine, in Morocco, across 14 centuries, really, and you know, is adding to that body of work, is responding to it, and so on. So there's very, very much an Arab literature that is conscious of itself as such. And I think it's interesting. All of us are people who write Arabic literature in a different language. And I think it's interesting that we are, well, not Reza, sorry, but he's close enough to be encompassed in this. And I think we're writers of fiction. I think poetry is a completely different ballgame, really. But fiction itself has, of course, Arabic fiction has been completely influenced, if not born of, Western literary fiction. I mean, everybody accepts and admits that the novel as an art form in Arabic was born of being exposed to the novel as an art form in English and French and Russian and so on. And so the fact that here we are, Arab authors who are writing in different languages as well, I think can almost be seen as a natural extension, if you like, of Arabic fiction.
I wanted to go to Reza here. So William did not mention this in the introduction, I don't think, but Reza has edited an anthology called Tablet and Pen. I believe the subtitle is Literary Landscapes from the Middle East, or of the Middle East?
Of the Middle East, yeah.
And you've defined this rather broadly, I think. Manta, we said, is one person who is included, who will be familiar to everyone in the audience here, also Chugtai. As you were sitting, well, let me ask you before we go further with this, What was the motivation for putting together an anthology like this? This came out in 2010, I think.
Yeah, 2011, yeah.
2011. What was the motivation, and what was sort of guiding you both aesthetically as you were looking at these texts, but then also, I think, politically in terms of what you hoped, or maybe you didn't have this way of thinking about it, what you thought this might achieve in terms of exposing readers in the West to this writing?
Right. Well, first of all, let me begin by saying that there's no surer way to start a fight than to call an Iranian an Arab. No, just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I backed up.
Well, so I do admit that the subtitle is kind of problematic. That's how subtitles are sometimes, and often writers don't have that much choice in the way that those things are created by editors and publishers. But the anthology is literature of the last 100 years translated from Turkish, Persian, Arabic, and Urdu, many for the first time. And those four languages are languages that are profoundly uncovered in Western literature. I mean, these are some of the titans of global literature. You've mentioned two of them. And Westerners are simply unaware of this incredible literary tradition when they look at this region of the world, West, Central, South Asia. They see it almost wholly through the lens of either religion or politics, as though those are the only things that matter to the people of this region. And when in reality, the thing that is, I think, most animating in these cultures is the arts, literature, architecture. I mean, this is what gave birth. I mean, this is truly the cradle of storytelling in many ways. And so, the first thing that I wanted to do was introduce Western readers of English, to this great body of literature. But I had a second agenda, which was that the literature is from 1910 to 2010, and it's put together in such a way as to read almost as though it's a single narrative. I mean, that was my goal. That most anthologies are, you pick it up and you just sort of read a little bit here and a little bit there, but I wanted something that you read from the first page to the last, and you felt as though you read a single sustained story about this region, about the last 100 years of this region. And in a way, I think of it as almost a new kind of a history book, one that's not written by Westerners or outsiders or academics or colonialists, but one that's written by the artists, the poets, the writers of the region. It's in their words. So that was my primary motivation.
Do you think one runs the risk of sort of imposing a continuity on this body of work, or do you think that in fact you're unveiling or uncovering this idea that work in these different languages, which might have been perceived to be separate from one another, should indeed be seen as part of a sort of continuum?
It's such a wonderful question, and that is a real difficulty that any editor has. And so what I wanted to do was I compiled thousands and thousands of poems and stories from these four languages during this 100 years. And then I just spent months just reading it and reading it. And I really wanted to make sure that master narrative that I was talking about came out in a natural way. Now, it is true that once I saw that line, that narrative, pieces that I liked but that didn't fit that narrative, I removed from the book just to maintain sort of the overall feel of it. But I like to think that I did as good a job as can be done by any editor to stay out of it as much as possible. And that master narrative, by the way, is a very interesting one to this panel, because what I discovered was that what we understand about this region, the very concept of nationalism, the idea of the nation state as not just a factor of your identity, but the supreme factor of your identity, which after all is the definition of nationalism as we understand it in the 20th century view of it, was shaped not by politicians, but by writers. It was the poets and the writers who gave birth to Arab identity as we know it, who gave birth to the modern Middle East. It was Turkish writers who defined what the modern state of Turkey actually means against both the Ottoman hegemony and against Western colonialism. It was the writers and the poets who defined what the nation state means, and then very quickly those same writers and poets became the enemy of the nation state. And the best example of it, Tablet and Pen, of course, is the title of a famous poem by Fez Ahmed Fez, who wrote in Urdu, and whose writings really kind of fashioned a clear Pakistani identity, really became the voice for the birth of Pakistan, until Pakistan became a reality, and then was immediately imprisoned and became the primary social critic of that state.
Let me go to Selma here. I wanted to go back to you with a version of the same question that I put to Adaf at the beginning, which is about this question of sort of categorization. And you had said when we were speaking earlier that you wondered if maybe this was becoming a slightly obsolete way to think about literature as kind of divided into sort of regional categories.
Well, yeah, I think because I'm so hybrid, I tend to, every time I get snug in a particular category that I move towards, I inevitably come across the purists who'll kind of kick me out of it. So I mean, with some of the definitions of Arabic literature, I just wouldn't fit in at all. And it's quite interesting if you're sort of a mixed identity and you're writing, you've got a British passport and you're writing in English, but you choose a subject matter which is Arab-based, then you can get put into the Arab category. Whereas with some writers like, for example, Kazuo Ishiguro, who writes about very British subject matter, would be considered as a very British writer. So sometimes it seems to, the fault line seems to depend on what you're writing about and what you're concerned with. I mean, I sometimes think it's more the way that I read literature is not so often now in terms of looking at the country people are from, but the themes they're dealing with. And particularly when I was, wanting to look for inspiration when I was writing my novel, these issues about how politics is written about in a literary form, I was looking more at South America than perhaps Arab writers as a source of influence, and looking at uses of the absurd. So it was more of a kind of thematic way of looking at other literatures, And I think it would be quite refreshing if sometimes literature was looked at like, how do these writers deal with the family, across the board, rather than just saying, how do Arabs, as though having some Arab blood or an Arab name or whatever is going to be your main motivator in how you look at the family. It's not so different wherever you are.
So let me ask you another question though, because your first novel out of it. Oh. I'll take this moment to remind everyone in the audience, if your cell phones are still on, to turn them off.
Do not follow my example.
Yeah. And I'm just relieved it wasn't me.
Yes.
No, so, you've written a novel, your first novel, which is set in Gaza, and which is, very much about the tribulations of a single family. And you talked a bit about the, dilemma is maybe not quite the right word, but about the situation of writing about something from the outside of it, and yet reading the book, it doesn't read as if it's a book that's written from the outside of where it takes place.
Yeah, I mean, I had been to Gaza before I wrote the book, but I'd been there in the late 90s, and it was a brief visit, and it was a very kind of cursory impressions that I got when I went there. And then I was away from Gaza for about 10 years while I started writing this novel. And actually, when I decided that I wanted to write a novel, I didn't really have a place particularly in mind. I had an image, I had a feeling of frustration. It could have been Iraq, it could have been south of Lebanon, and I wanted to keep it very abstract. And I actually wanted to, I'd read a Boliano short story I was kind of influenced by, and I thought, okay, what if I just give them X's and Y's as names to free people up from all these negative associations which come with being Arab? And I tried it as a short story, and it kind of worked, and it was a bit exciting, but I didn't feel I could follow it through as a novel, but it was what I wanted to write as a novel. And then I decided the place where I wanted to set it was Gaza, but I couldn't actually go to Gaza at that time. So I wrote a fictional Gaza. I fictionalized it. I based it on blogs, research, outside sources. And I was kind of, there are writers like Kafka's America was written without going to America. I think Barbara Kingsolver hadn't been to the Congo for a long time when she wrote Poisonwood Bible. There are possibilities of writing from the outside, and I was quite... So, and any fiction writer, it is the question of being an imagined place that you're creating. It's your impression of it. So I wrote this novel. And then the novel was actually out by the time I went back to Gaza. And some of the things which had happened in my novel had not happened when I wrote the novel. I had a bombardment of a hospital and a school, which actually had happened more in Jenin, but not Gaza when I was writing. By the time I'd gone, all these things had happened. You know, there was this horrible, kind of sickening prophetic feeling about the book, and it's now sometimes being called the caste-led novel, which is also sort of ironic. But when I went back there, it was this very unusual feeling to see a country that you've created in your mind in reality, and to see whether or not you've got it right. And most of the time I think I did, but occasionally I thought my tonality was a little bit off. Maybe sometimes I'd talk to one particularly inspirational person and think, right, I've got it too dark. My novel's just too dark. And then I'd hear something else and I'd think it was too light. But it was a particular experience about writing from the outside.
Well, I think this question of writing from the outside is an interesting one, and I will come to Tahar now. You know, as we sat or as I sat at least to prepare for this panel, I tried to think about, you know, what are some themes and what are some threads that, you know, might be seen to run through the Arab experience, might be seen to, you know, be common to, you know, Arab writers of the last several generations, and what are things that come up frequently in these books. And one thing that struck me as a theme that one often saw was this question of crossing borders, of mingling of cultures, and of, you know, look at a book like Tayeb Salah's Season of Migration to the North, which is really about someone who goes to the West and then comes back and his experience of Sudan upon returning. So for Tahar to ask him about this position of writing from the outside, to have sort of one foot in Morocco and one foot in France, and kind of how that structures your thinking about the fiction you're writing.
Oui, d'abord, on écrit toujours de l'extérieur.
You always write from the exterior.
C'est comme une abeille qui va tomber dans un pot de miel, elle ne va pas travailler.
A fly who falls into honey, a cup of honey, will not be able to
Elle a besoin de
work.
partir.
The bee will need to fly away to be able to work.
Et l'écrivain est toujours en exil, même chez lui.
And a writer is always in exile, even when he lives at home.
Alors, je voulais juste préciser une chose, pourquoi la tradition littéraire arabe est avant tout poétique.
I wanted to explain why the Arab tradition is before all poetic.
Pourquoi les Arabes sont arrivés au roman récemment seulement, c'est-à-dire il y a un siècle.
Why did the Arabs arrive to Arab writers actually arrived to novels recently, within the last century?
Le premier roman arabe qui a été publié, ça a été publié en feuilleton au Caire. Il s'appelle Zainab.
The first Zainab, the first Arab novel published in Egypt
en 1912.
In 1912.
Parce que tout simplement, la société arabe ne reconnaît pas l'individu.
Because the Arab society did not recognize the individual.
Et quand on ne reconnaît pas l'individu, on ne reconnaît que le clan ou la tribu.
So you recognize the clan or the tribe.
On ne peut pas mettre en avant un individu comme personnage pour faire du roman.
So it's very difficult to put forward one character of a novel as an individual.
Ce qui explique aussi la condition de la femme dans tous les pays arabes et musulmans toujours. Oui.
Which also explains the condition of women in the Arab and Muslim world.
A été victime de cette façon de ne pas reconnaître l'individu, de ne pas émerger l'individu.
So the women were also the victims of a society which would not permit the individual to be recognized.
Alors
as such.
quand on me pose la question, est-ce que tu es un écrivain arabe ou un écrivain français, je leur dis ce sont des questions que me posent les gendarmes ou la police des frontières.
When people ask me if I'm an Arab writer or a French writer, actually it's when I cross customs and they ask me if I'm Arab or French.
Si je dis je suis écrivain français, les Arabes vont me dire tu es un traître.
If I say I'm a French author, the Arabs are going to say you traitor.
Si je dis aux Français je suis un écrivain arabe, je dis tu n'es pas reconnaissant.
If I say I'm an Arab writer, they're going to say how ungrateful.
Donc on est dans une situation terrible. Alors moi je préfère la définition « ma patrie, c'est la langue ».
So that's a terrible dilemma, and I prefer to answer, my homeland is my language.
En même temps, on a le droit d'avoir plusieurs patries.
And you're allowed to have several homelands.
Moi, j'aimerais bien être indien.
I would love to be Indian.
Oui, pourquoi pas. Un jour, on m'a posé la question, c'était sur le roman, j'ai fait une communication, je dis, je suis un écrivain japonais.
One day I was in an event and I said, you know what, I'm a Japanese writer.
Et quelqu'un, c'est vrai parce que Murakami, on lui a dit, est-ce que vous êtes japonais? Il a dit, j'aime le sushi.
Murakami once was asked, about being Japanese, and he said, well, I love sushi.
C'est tout. Alors, moi, je suis marocain, je suis arabe, j'aime bien le couscous, mais enfin, c'est pas...
I'm Moroccan, I'm Arab, I love couscous, but that's not enough.
Cette question d'identité, moi, je suis un écrivain réellement japonais. Ça se voit pas, mais j'ai pas les idées ridées, mais je suis japonais.
If you ask me in terms of identity, I don't have slanted eyes, but I'm a Japanese author.
Et je vous jure, quand je lis les écrivains japonais, eh bien, je me reconnais dedans.
I recognize myself in Japanese novels which I
Comme ça,
read.
le problème est résolu. Je ne suis pas arabe, je ne suis pas français, je suis japonais. C'est tranquille.
Okay,
là.
we've solved the problem. I'm not Arab, not French, Japanese.
Alors, j'ai trouvé une patrie idéale, d'autant plus que les Japonais, comme les Indiens, sont des gens très bien.
Isn't that wonderful? Japanese are just as wonderful as Indians, so I've found my homeland.
Alors, une fois que cette question est
This
résolue,
being said,
il n'y a maintenant plus de questions sur l'identité.
so no more questions on identity.
Alors, nous avons le droit d'écrire sur tout.
We are allowed to write on everything,
Et pas uniquement sur l'exil ou l'immigration.
and not only on exile or immigration.
On a le droit d'écrire aussi sur le bonheur et le malheur.
We can write on happiness. We can write on
Sur le mariage et le divorce.
on marriage, on divorce,
Ce sont des choses qui nous concernent aussi.
which concern us too.
Pourquoi un écrivain arabe ne va parler que des problèmes du monde arabe qui sont énormes?
Why should an Arab writer only write on Arab problems? They're enormous.
Alors, je parle des choses qui me touchent et qui touchent aussi le public.
I write on what touches me,
alors,
and therefore touches you too.
Il faut dire une chose, c'est que d'abord, il faut faire un peu de politique.
Let's do a little bit of politics
pas
here,
beaucoup.
just a bit.
Le monde arabe n'existe pas. Hein.
The Arab world doesn't exist.
Il y a 21 États
There are 21 countries.
qui ne sont pas unis du tout.
They're not at all unified,
Ils sont tous en bagarre les uns avec les
and
autres.
they're all fighting against one another.
Donc, mais ils ont en commun une langue,
But they have in common one thing, which is the language,
la langue arabe classique,
classical Arabic,
que le peuple ne parle pas.
which the normal people don't speak.
Alors,
Classical Arabic.
vous imaginez, tout le monde parle une arabe classique, que le peuple ne comprend rien.
The normal people can't understand
Alors,
classical
nous avons
Arabic.
en commun une langue arabe,
So we have a common language,
mais qui
Arabic,
est réservée à
but
une élite.
reserved to the happy few, to the elite, to the cultured people.
Let me come in here for 1 second. I want to go to Adaf here with something that Tahar you said at the beginning, which was this idea of Arab culture thinking. I may be misquoting you here. Less in terms of the individual and more in terms of the collective. And I'm curious about, what some of these sort of threads that we see as kind of common themes in Arab literature, not in all of it, of course. But Adaf, one of these that strikes me is this idea of a tension between the individual and the collective. And whether you think, A, this is a subject that has often been of interest to Arab writers, and B, whether you think Tahar is right, actually, that there is a sort of preference or a precedence given to the collective rather than to the individual in Arab culture.
I don't really see why one needs to make such sweeping generalizations. I mean, I don't trust big general statements about a culture or a people. I think Tahir bin Jelloun has expressed something really important when he said that he feels an empathy with a Japanese novel. I mean, certainly what literature at its very best does is that it enables you to live experiences that you have never lived, and to feel empathy with characters and friendship with characters that you would never in real life meet. And that is why, I guess, literature is, in a sense, a force for the good, because it, through living in a novel or a story, you kind of recognize your common humanity with the people of a different culture, and so that really is what I think that literature does. Now, whether there are overarching themes in literature that is written in Arabic, I think the overarching themes in general come from what sort of people are experiencing. And so in the Arab world, one of the great common experiences is the experience of colonialism, for example, and of the fight for liberation, and of what form that fight would take, and of the different answers to that question. And so therefore, that is a major theme in the Arab novel.
Right.
Of a certain point. And then obviously, again, when technically this period is over, and so start looking at the novels of the 80s and the 90s, and you'll find novels that deal with the social issues of the day in the various countries, and with what direction society wants to go in.
Right.
And of course, there are the novels about women and women's liberation, and there are, I mean, so it's not very useful, I think, to try and isolate themes and say that they are particular to Arab writing. I mean, take a novel like George Eliot's Middlemarch. Now, that could be an Arab novel in the sense of the themes that it deals with,
right,
or The Mill on the Floss. It's just the local details that are different. But the issue of finding a voice and finding a place in the world and realizing your ambitions and so on, that's a theme for novels everywhere.
Selma, do you want to come in on this question?
No, I'd really concur with that. I mean, in terms of the universality of themes and the ability of the novel. I mean, what you're really trying to do, you're trying to communicate a reality which no other form, I think, is able to do so effectively, because there's such a direct relationship between the writer and the reader, which other art mediums don't really give you. Normally there are other people intervening in that image or presenting pictures, but you're actually building on the mental associations that the reader has. And that they can just build on the basis of words, which is quite special. And I think it allows people to, to move into the other person's skin and to walk around in their reality like no other form does. And I think particularly when you've got a region of the world like the Arab world, which is so sort of misunderstood and misrepresented, that this does throw up issues when you know that your book, if you're writing in a language, if you know that you're like English, when you know your book's going to be read by the outside, there is what can develop in the Anglophone Arab literature is a sort of a consciousness, an awareness of readership, which one shouldn't really shouldn't have, but does have, and has to be conscious of the fact that you have.
Yeah, I mean, is this a burden that look, the writer in every culture faces this burden of, if we look at the novel as, I think, essentially a humanist project, and in many ways a sort of an individualist project, or something that is about kind of describing with integrity and authenticity the lives of individuals, it seems to me a contradiction to then at the same time ask these novels to bear the burden of representing an entire culture. And yet, I think it cannot be denied that when we live in a moment where kind of stereotypes and abstractions and generalizations about the Arab world abound, that some of these works of literature, though they don't take this as their mandate, can serve as a kind of corrective to some of these cliches, to some of these stereotypes. Reza, I want to ask you about this in terms of what you were thinking. This anthology that you've produced strikes me as being very much of a political moment, which is the sort of post 9/11, America obsessed with Islam as this new threatening other.
I mean, I think you put your finger on something, because the job of the writer is to tell stories, and nothing gets in the way of a story more than idea or agenda or trying to kind of wrap yourself around these big themes. I mean, I teach writing at the University of California, and I'm always constantly trying to hammer into my students' heads that stories are about people, not about events. They're about people, not about ideas. But unfortunately, I think you're right. When you are sort of burdened with this responsibility that often comes from the expectations of the reader, not so much from any kind of inherent attempt by the writer to be representative of a people or a culture or a religion or an ethnicity, it can be absolute poison to the creative process. But I think, again, that also speaks to the magic of storytelling. You're right. I had a distinct agenda in mind in putting in this anthology together, but I think that agenda has to do with this fundamental fact that the only thing that's out there with the power to break through the walls that separate us into different nationalities, different peoples, different cultures, different religions is story. Story has the ability, because it is ultimately, as we've been saying, about the human condition, to just break through those walls and to reach us in a very visceral, intimate way, that it doesn't matter what God we pray to or what state we're a citizen of. And I think that's what I wanted to emphasize, is that these are ultimately stories that are about human beings, regardless of where they're from or how they live.
Let me ask Tahar about this, actually, about this, defending the integrity of the art and the story against this sort of easy way of kind of, taking it to represent an entire nation or taking it to represent, an entire religion or a region that spans, a third of the world.
Oui, on ne représente que soi-même.
You only represent yourself.
Et encore.
Maybe.
Et alors, mais ce qui est bien avec les écrivains dans le monde arabe, c'est que nous sommes pris au sérieux.
We're taken seriously. That's a good thing of us, Arab authors.
On est pris au sérieux par les lecteurs.
But we're taken seriously by the readers.
Et aussi par la police.
And also by the police, by the way.
Alors, ils lisent, ils font semblant de lire. Et la police.
And the policemen, they pretend that they read.
Et alors, on est souvent, on écrit, mais on pense que il y a un certain nombre de choses qu'il ne faut pas dire.
So we write and we think maybe something should not be written.
Alors je me souviens, une fois, j'ai eu une discussion avec quelqu'un de la police qui voulait interdire un de mes livres, mais qui n'a pas réussi.
I was talking with a police guy who wanted to ban my book. He wasn't able to.
Dans un roman, je raconte l'histoire d'une femme qui se prostitue.
I was in one of my stories. That's the story of a woman who prostitutes herself.
Alors, je lui dis, qu'est-ce qui vous choque,
qu'une
femme se prostitue, ou que moi j'écris qu'une femme se prostitue?
So what are you shocked by? The fact that there's a woman who's a prostitute, or the fact that I write about a woman who's a prostitute?
Alors, en fait, ce qui gêne vraiment, ce qui gêne la censure, c'est la représentation de la réalité, et non pas la réalité.
So what is bothering censorship? It's the representation of reality rather than reality.
Et quand on se présente devant des étudiants,
when you're in front of students, or,
il nous demande des comptes. Il nous dit pourquoi tu n'as pas écrit sur telle situation?
So some students will say to me, why didn't you write about this situation or this situation?
On est vraiment sollicité parce que ils considèrent que nous sommes comme des émissaires.
Because they would want us to be their emissaries.
Et c'est un rôle difficile. Alors, en Occident, souvent, on dit le silence des intellectuels arabes. Cette phrase est souvent
Sometimes
entendue.
in the West, you will hear about the so-called silence of Arab intellectuals.
Mais quand on leur demande, quand on leur dit on va parler, ils disent vous n'avez rien à dire.
And then when we say, okay, we'll talk, then they
Ou
say
alors-
you have nothing to say.
Ou alors ce que vous allez dire ne nous intéresse pas.
Or what you say is not interesting.
Enfin, il y a quand même une mauvaise foi. Et je voulais juste,
Sometimes that we are confronted with bad faith.
je voulais juste préciser aussi une chose à propos de la peur de la fiction.
I would like to talk about being frightened of fiction.
on accepte tout sauf la fiction. La fiction est plus dangereuse que la réalité.
Sometimes fiction seems more dangerous than reality.
Par exemple,
For example,
lorsque Salman Rushdie a publié les versets sataniques,
when Salman Rushdie published the Satanic Verses,
et qui a été condamné sans que personne n'ait lu son livre,
which was condemned by people who had not read it,
ce qu'on a reproché à Salman, ce n'est pas d'avoir critiqué l'islam. Tout simplement, il est musulman, donc il n'avait pas le droit de critique, d'avoir un point de vue sur l'islam.
he was not reproached to have written on Islam. He was reproached that being Muslim, he was not allowed to have a certain point of
Et
view
que,
on Islam.
que surtout, ça devient une fiction où le rire est possible. Le livre.
The book becomes, the book was a fiction where it was possible to laugh.
Et dès qu'on peut rire, eh bien, tout le monde tremble.
And people tremble when you're allowed to laugh.
Et c'est ainsi que, par exemple, dans le livre de Umberto Eco, Le nom de la rose,
In the Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco,
il montre que l'ennemi de la religion, c'est le rire.
he shows that the enemy of religion is laughing, or the laugh.
I think we're running out of time here, and it's been hard because there's so much to talk about. Adaf, you have just come from Cairo. I wanted to wind us up without getting too much into the politics of the last few years in the Arab world, but to talk a little bit about what role fiction might play, or whether fiction, in fact, at the moment, as you have, I think, at times suggested, may need to take a back seat while these events are underway, or that fiction is maybe not the best way to kind of come to terms with and think about what's happening in Egypt, in other parts of the Arab world right now.
Ooh, okay, right. I think if I could just say two things.
As much as you like, please.
Before one is really, they're just sort of two cautionary notes, if I might. One is on the issue of Rushdie and the Satanic Verses and other sort of books or art objects that have been picked up like this, that we really need to be very, very aware of the role that political opportunism plays in crises like these. As Tahir rightly noted, most of the people who were so incensed about the book had never read it. And the issue really is that there is a moment at which a particular object serves as a rallying point for a political position. And so this is really complete political opportunism. And if it hadn't been that book, it would have been something else. It was that Imam Khomeini saw at that moment that this book would serve to rally against anti-Muslim sentiment. And that's really why that whole furore was created. And so I think that as not only as writers and readers, but as responsible citizens, we should always be aware of what political agenda is playing in the reception of works of art. And the other thing is that, of course, necessarily, because we are here, we work in English, and we're talking at the Jaipur Festival, where, of course, you are also readers of English. We talk about representation and about the responsibility of representation, but I think that valid as this is and important as it is, I think that it is also good to remember that this is not the issue that most exercises or that most engages writers in Arabic. If you are an Arab writer living in Egypt or living in Tunis or Lebanon and you're working in Arabic, your primary concern is not how your country or how your religion or whatever is represented in the West. This is really a marginal concern. And people who are working in Arabic are concerned with issues of their society and with issues of their art, of experimentation, of the relationship between form and function, and so on, just as workers in every language are. And so I think just to be
Well, let me ask you, is it a trap for a writer to kind of come to occupy the role of a spokesman? Or I want to read you something that you wrote in a review of, you're reviewing a collection of Palestinian short stories, and you say, we all know that a great deal is lost in translation, but sometimes translations can misrepresent the text. And this is particularly dangerous when a reader believes he or she is gaining some insight into the consciousness of a people. And I think many Western readers read novels or fiction or art of various kinds, films from the rest of the world, through this sort of political lens. They make the writer or the artist or the filmmaker into a spokesman or a native informant in a way. Is this something that has to be avoided, that a writer has to strain not to get drawn into?
Well, I think you can't strain against it in your writing. I think you have to be very careful when you're talking about your writing and when you're answering questions to put this proviso, as Tahir said, that you represent nobody except yourself. And I think that is a problem. I think with Arabic literature particularly, and I think because it has not been hugely well served by translation, even when there is a lot of translation happening, it's not really brilliant translation. And so people tend, if they read it, to read it as a window into a culture rather than for literary enjoyment. I mean, if you think of other literatures, I don't think that anybody reads Saramago to know about his culture. I don't think anybody reads Marquez thinking, now I understand something about Latin America,
Right.
Because
it's very magical in Latin America. That's what they would come away with.
Exactly. Because in the translation has managed, by being so brilliant, has managed to actually convey the literary value of those works and has managed to actually make it possible for the reader in English to read these works for enjoyment rather than as a peephole. And we're not there yet.
Well, this is a good question, though. Anyone on the panel can take this up. As interest in Arab literature in the West has increased, possibly for, odd reasons that we might not all be happy about, is the quality of translation beginning to improve? I don't know, Reza, if you came across this when putting together the anthology. Are we getting a finer class of translators who are not necessarily, who are literary above all, rather than being sociologists or people who have a kind of political interest in the Arab world?
So I'm part of an organization called Words Without Borders, and the organization was instrumental in helping with the anthology. What we do is that we take literature from all over the world in every language you can possibly imagine, contemporary literature being written right now, we translate it into English and we put it on wordswithoutborders.org for anyone to read, and you can sort of choose by region, by language, or whatever. But the rule that we have in our translations is that we don't allow professional translators to do the translating. We get poets who happen to also know Arabic. So we get fiction writers who can both speak Chinese and English. What we do is we get people who are themselves literary, but who happen to also be bilingual rather than professional translators, and it makes a huge difference.
All right, I'm going to give our final question to Tahar, which is a vague and open-ended one. As we're talking about translation here, is all fiction in some ways an act of translation?
Oui, nous traduisons beaucoup le silence.
We translate silence.
Les silences de nos sociétés, des choses qu'il ne faut pas dire, des choses qu'il faut cacher.
The silences of our society, of the things which must not be said, of the things which must
Et moi,
be hidden.
personnellement, le fait d'écrire en français
The fact that personally I write in French
m'a permis de dépasser certains tabous.
allowed me to go beyond certain taboos.
Parce que l'arabe classique est une langue fantastique, merveilleuse.
Because classical Arabic is a fantastic, wonderful language.
Mais
But
on me dit souvent, attention, c'est la langue du Coran, donc il faut faire attention.
but people say, beware, it's the language of the Quran, beware.
Or, un écrivain, c'est quelqu'un qui maltraite la langue.
And an author is allowed to mistreat a language.
J'aurais pas pu maltraiter la langue arabe sans risquer ma vie.
I would have been at risk if I had mistreated the Arabic language. I'm less at risk when I mistreat the French
N'exagérons pas,
language.
mais disons que la langue arabe, elle est sacralisée.
It's sacralized, the Arabic language.
Alors, en ce moment, il y a des tentatives au Maroc de jeunes qui écrivent en arabe dialectal.
There are attempts nowadays, young Moroccan authors who are trying to write in local Arabic.
Et alors, le public est très réduit, c'est-à-dire un livre qui est écrit en arabe dialectal ne sera pas compris par une égyptienne ou une
But the problem is that it is a very narrow readership. Only Moroccans can understand dialectical Moroccan, but not in Egypt or not in other countries.
Mais le résultat est le même parce que quand on écrit en arabe classique,
But the result will be the same anyway.
les livres existent, mais ils ne circulent pas dans le monde arabe. C'est-à-dire un livre qui est publié au Maroc n'arrivera pas en Syrie, n'arrivera pas en Irak, n'arrivera pas en Égypte.
There is no, unfortunately, there's no distribution. Even if you write in classical Arabic, actually, if you publish in Morocco, it will not reach Iraq.
Écrire en arabe dialectal, en arabe classique, le principal c'est d'écrire.
So whether you write in classical Arabic or in local Arabic, the most important thing actually is to write.
All right, thank you very much to all of our panelists. I know we've gone over a little bit, but I hope we can stretch slightly. I'm sure whatever's coming after us can't be terribly important.
We actually have two panelists going straight off to a panel, so we do have to keep to time.
There we are.
Can I just request that everybody keeps their questions short and asks a question? So we're trying to get to as many of you as possible. Okay, we have a lady here.
Hello. Just briefly, my question comes from a position of ignorance. I'm an academic and I don't read much literature. I'm wondering about what happened to who can write about what. So 150 years ago, 120 years ago, European travelers or officials, writers, could write about India, about the Arab world, about Russia, about whatever. And now they don't very much. I mean, there's been a very striking shift in academia where white people can only now write about history and within the very small dying genre of ethnographic writing, which has no sales.
Have you met William, our festival director?
Well, quite. He's writing about history. But there are very few people from the West now who are allowed, in a way, who are entitled, who are to write about different parts of the world now.
Okay, do you have a...
And the question is, in the same way that Arabs or Iranians or Indians are pushed by a force that my question is about, to write about their own people, as it were, on their behalf, rather than about whatever it is that they want to write about. What is the force that pushes people to speak on behalf of their own rather than about whatever it is that they're interested in writing about?
Selma, do you want to field this one? I feel like, I mean, I'm not sure the premise is necessarily airtight, but Selma, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that there's a growing movement in the way that fiction and writing is looked at, where who the writer is becoming increasingly important, and this is partly because of mistakes of the past and perceptions of the past. There might be a sort of backlash at the moment. I think from where we're sitting, it's a sort of because there aren't enough people representing a particular area, and a lot of the Arab writers writing in Arabic are not getting distributed enough, etc. So that's a problem. But I mean, personally, my sort of theory on it is it really shouldn't... Sorry, and for the second point about why I think there's more sort of autobiographical interest in the writer, and the writer is becoming a much bigger part in what the book is or what the product is, and is being assessed in the same way together, is because of the growth of the internet, the amount that writers are meant to sort of write about themselves. They're a product, they're an item, right? They're part of this book. And it should be, some writers argue that, I think it was Deborah Mogga who said something like, the writer should be no more than like the driver in the car with the headlights going out. It's just what you see. The writer should actually be somehow concealed. And I think, strictly speaking, that is really where we should be, in a way, that our personal identities should be concealed for the purpose of assessing that book and reading that book. It's the responsibility and sensitivity of the individual writer in handling any subject matter which should count, and the way that it's done, rather than what particular ethnicity they come from, how well they've researched it, how studious they've been in doing it, how sensitivity and responsibility, I'd say, are my two key sort of qualifiers on that.
Does anyone, Adaf, do you want to add anything to that? No. Next question.
Yes, I was in Egypt some years ago, and I tried to interview Mahfouz. His wife told me that he's not well at all because earlier he had been knifed in the neck by the Islamic Brotherhood. I also tried to interview a professor of philosophy who would not agree to the interview to be taped. Do you think after the Arab Spring, after all the rebellions and change of regimes, a writer will be more free or less free?
I'm going to leave this to Adaf.
Right. Well, I think actually writers have created their freedom. I think if you look at Arab literature, you will not find a literature that is written in imprisonment, as it were. It is free. And of course, we have had that incident of Mahfouz being knifed and Farag Fouda being killed. That's back in the 90s, in the heyday of that kind of attack. So, I mean, my instinct is to say that after all these revolutions, people will be more free, but that doesn't apply to writers because I think they are free already. But we are, of course, always looking for more freedom. But we'll see. I mean, we have the Brotherhood in government now in Egypt, and, you know, it's interesting times ahead.
Gentleman to your left, I
Hello?
believe.
Yeah.
Yes, stand up, please, sir.
I would want to make a comment like, in history we see the roles of intellectuals has been very strong in bringing out the revolutions. But now when we are talking about globalization and making a world without borders, still countries like India, Nepal, Sri Lanka lack revolution and having a lot of intellectuals around the world. Don't you think it's very sad?
Is it the duty of intellectuals to foment revolution? I guess that's how I'm going to parse that question. Anyone want to take that?
Well, I guess it's the duty of intellectuals to speak the truth and to speak truth to power, and that if that leads to revolution, then that's a good thing, and it is their duty. Yes.
I mean, it's true that in many parts of the world that in which there is no such thing as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the writer becomes the journalist, the historian, the social critic, and literature takes on the role of putting a mirror up to society and showing its failings. And if that's revolutionary activity, then yeah, absolutely.
Who's, I don't know where the microphone is.
Just here,
yeah.
just in front of you.
This is for Tahir Ben. Paul Celan wrote about his concentration camp experience in Germany, in German. Can you visualize a situation where somebody from Palestine writing in Hebrew and getting accepted or getting comfortable in Israeli circle? Thank you.
You understand, no?
Well, he's saying that Paul Celan wrote about his concentration camp experience in German. There are a number of Palestinian writers who have written in Hebrew. I don't know if that's an easy answer to that question or if Tahar wants to take up this himself. Can you write in the language of your oppressor, I suppose, is the broadest way to answer that to phrase that question.
Oui, il y a des écrivains palestiniens qui s'expriment en hébreu, comme Antoine Chamès.
There are Palestinian writers who write in Hebrew.
Qui malheureusement n'écrit plus, enfin il refuse d'écrire. Bien sûr qu'on peut écrire dans n'importe quelle langue.
You can write in any other language, including the language of the oppressor.
Et puis il y a eu Emil Habibi, qui était un écrivain palestinien qui était aussi israélien.
Emil Habibi was a great writer, Palestinian writer of Israeli citizenship.
Et qui a introduit la critique par l'humour
et
l'ironie.
He introduced humor, irony, and criticism through humor and irony in his works.
Et c'est un écrivain important dans l'histoire de la Palestine.
A very important writer, Emil Habibi, in the life of in the history of Palestine.
Can I just add, there's a playwright called Amir Zorbi who writes sometimes in Hebrew. He's Palestinian Israeli. And he said that, I mean, his work is full of humor and irony. It's very dark. And he said something like, it seems to us that sometimes the Jews have lost their humor, the old Yiddish humor. And he's very much influenced by, he's read all the, great Jewish works. And he said, we, the Palestinians, we've taken it on for them.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe last question here.
Stand?
Go ahead, yeah.
I wanted, as a literature student, I wanted to ask a question slightly more literary. We talked a lot about content and about who writers are and what they're writing about, and then we sort of turn to how things are being written. As a panel who are intimately, you anthologize, you write, you are intimately involved with and connected with Arab writing, I wondered whether, like with some feminist writing, French feminist writing, for example, you can speak to something specific in the form of Arab literature. I don't know whether there is. That's why I'm asking you. But if there is, I'd be fascinated to know how you describe it.
Very simple question. Anyone?
What experiments in form is what you're asking about?
Maybe drawn from sort of Arab sources or from a heritage of poetry or storytelling tradition. Are there formal?
Hold on. Would you like the mic back? Do you need the mic back?
Someone have a go at this.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, you could say that there. Well, all the work that's being done in the vernacular, for example, is specific, I guess, to Arab culture and is drawing on old traditions of balladeering and so on. But also with, formal. The formal kind of frameworks of poetry. Also in fiction, there have been attempts to take on the form of the maqama. I mean, it's just very hard to talk about this because it's all to do with Arabic words and Arabic literary traditions, which nobody's going to be particularly. But yeah, I mean, there are definitely attempts to take on old Arab forms and mold them into something new, as well as things like novels written in sort of email speak and internet speak and Twitter speak and so on, which of course is not specifically Arab. But yeah, there is a lot of experimentation happening.
I think if I can be pedantic, you could pick up an Ilyas Houri novel called Gate of the Sun, which is both about the Palestinian experience and also like a lot of sort of more experimental bits of Arab fiction, very much written in light of the 1001 Nights as a kind of organizing. I mean, you see, I think, formal echoes like that.
I think we'll have to wrap things up
Very
there.
good.
Sorry, Jonathan.
Okay.
A big round of applause for our amazing panel. What a wonderful session. Thank you so much.